ACT is a response to the growing awareness over climate change and what we perceived as a lack of planning for climate change impacts at the policy level. The areas of study that we're going to be looking at over 4 years include biodiversity, and that's the subject obviously of the current session, extreme weather events and natural hazards, that's coming up in May. Energy production and distribution, we'll be looking at clean energy and ways it can adapt to the kinds of changes that are happening in our natural systems. Health risks, crop adaptation, fresh water supply, population displacement, sea level rise, and new technologies. So that's our aim to do 6-month sessions on each of those subjects over the next 4 years. Once we scratched the surface and started really digging into what was happening in the world of adaptation, we discovered that there's lots and lots of work being done on it. There's tons of expertise. This room houses some of it. And what we really want to do is draw on that expertise. We don't want to duplicate anything. We want to draw on the amazing resources that are here in BC, across Canada, and in the international community, and see what we can bring out of collaborative interactions. And also work with policymakers who stand in each of the areas that we're studying, and produce policy findings that we hope will be a resource for decision makers as they face the quite severe challenges that it looks as though we may be facing in the coming years.
What I'd like to talk about today is the scope of some of the potential changes that are in front of us, some of the implications of those changes to British Columbia, and then what we're doing currently to prepare. And I'll come right out front and say that we don't have all the answers. We've got a plan in place to guide us now, but the work that you're going to do through the ACT and the work that others will do will certainly help us modify those and inform government of some of the policy things that we need to be looking at. So I look forward to the work that's coming out of the Action Climate Change team here at SFU. So there's a whole bunch of productive forests outside that timber harvesting land base that the industry or government just does not manage in a commercial sense. So that area will be adapting pretty much on its own, and we'll be working on the commercial harvesting land base to make sure that it adapts properly. And where I live up in Prince George, over the course of the last 100 years, we've seen an increase in the mean annual winter temperature of about somewhere between 2.2 and 2.6 degrees. And some of this is the reason why we've got the situation with the mountain pine beetle epidemic that we have right now. Those warmer, medium winter temperatures mean you've got much greater overwintering survival of mountain pine beetle. You're not getting the mortality in the wintertime, and that's what's led to partly to the epidemic that we have today.
In the summer, the lower stream flows are going to present two types of barriers, both a physical barrier when there's, in some cases, not enough water for the salmon to use to migrate back to their spawning grounds in the summer, but also temperature barriers. And we see this quite a bit in the U.S. portion of the basin when you get water temperatures that are too low for the salmon. They will wait. I think this has been an issue in Vancouver Island as well. Something there. But the salmon will literally just sit and wait out low temperatures. And the problem is that once salmon have started their return migration and enter the freshwater system, they stop eating. So they are effectively drying down the body reserves as they wait for the cooler temperatures, which of course increases the risk that they won't make it back to the spawning grounds, or at least won't be as healthy by the time they get back there. But the real question is what happens in the open ocean, and we don't have a good sense of what will happen in the open ocean. We do see that with El Niños, warmer coastal waters, we see less favorable conditions for salmon. As I mentioned, the changes in zooplankton from Arctic to more subtropical zooplankton. Also, the change in predator species, more tuna and mackerel that come up from the south and change the food web dynamics in ways that are less favorable to salmon. We don't know, however, if we can assume that coastal ocean temperatures will be warmer. It also depends on how rules change and how that affects coastal uploading of cooler, more nutrient-rich waters.
Is there any evidence or consideration that if we're entering this cooling phase of the PDO, that might have a dampening effect on anthropogenic forcing climate?
It could. It's, it's, again, it doesn't mean that every year that you always get real weather conditions. And in fact, using a different example, using La Nina as an example, 2000-2001 was a La Nina year, and it was a terrible drought in the Pacific Northwest, and the U.S. fortunately mentioned so here as well. It just basically didn't start raining until December, terrible year. But similarly with PDO, I mean, it's from year to year, it depends on how these factors play out. But overall, you would expect that it could have a dampening effect. Of course, the question is whether, which is stronger. At some point, does the climate change signal become stronger so that instead of saying it necessarily leads to cooler conditions, maybe it just leads to normal, what we now define as normal conditioning.
About 20 years following an extended period of warm and wet conditions, which sounds like PDO, most areas of BC are more likely, more vulnerable to spruce flatworm outbreaks than normal conditions. Summary, temperature trends are accelerating, nighttime lows are increasing more than daytime highs, and winter more than other seasons, and we've already heard how this has impacted the amount of pine beetle outbreak. Precipitation trends are variable, which I haven't really shown that much. Additional long-term increases, but in the short term, this actually decreases in many locations, particularly in the summer. Temperature and precipitation, if you look at these two things together, which I haven't done, you find very complex changes to snowpack and stream flow. That is in our climate overview report. And the thing, most interesting finding to me from these relative trends is that if you, this BC Biodiversity report that's coming out will show all of the different ecozones, the VEC zones in BC and various states of conservation status. And the 4 VEC zones that are the most threatened do happen to lie in those areas that have the largest relative trends. So I think that there's not enough for cause and effect there, but I think it's enough to warrant continued use of these relative trends to see if we can make some use of them. And then finally, that trends are one thing that's interesting for context. I think that's, we can use them to develop impact models, but it ends there. And then we really need to get into how do we adapt to climate change, how do we use this information to create future projections that can be used for decision.
So here's what I'm going to do, because there's been a lot of talk about this report on biodiversity. I'm going to give you a little bit of the background on what that's all about and where it came from. And then I'm going to go through the 3 different realms that we address in this report, the terrestrial, the freshwater aquatic, and the marine, and give you a few examples of some species in those realms that have already been affected. Now, I'm not talking about future trends here at all. I'm talking about measured things that have already occurred. And then if there's time, I'd like to just briefly talk about traditional phenological knowledge, because it's quite a neat way to integrate information about what's happening in a particular place. Yellow cedar. There are patches of yellow cedar showing up in Alaska and in northern BC that are dying. And these patches, the leading hypothesis anyway, is that in the north, there isn't quite enough snow cover in a certain elevational band to protect the roots during spring freezes. So they're finding these between about 300 meters and 400 meters in northern BC. Other cedar, western red cedar and grand fir, these seem to be particularly susceptible on the southern end of Vancouver Island. It's drought that seems to be driving this. The arborists in the municipalities on the southern end of Vancouver Island began noticing that the grand fir, they were having to cut them down in huge numbers, starting about 5 years ago. And I don't know how many of you know Richard Hebda, but red cedar is one of the things, his mantra. On the east side of Vancouver Island, they seem to be dying. And obviously these, not all of them, but in areas particularly where there are shallow soils, and they're more susceptible to drought. So in addition to the yellow warbler, which is a species that was already here and has extended its range, there are 25 birds that are now in BC that were not on the original list that Ian McTaggart-Cowan put together in 1947. So in summary, I just want to point out that although I've mentioned species for the most part here, it really isn't just a story about species, because species are wrapped up in all the interactions that they're involved in. So their interactions are affected, the ecosystems are shifting, ecosystems are coming apart, ecosystems are going to be reconfiguring, and of course then that means the structures are altered, and the various functions that all these things are involved in are also disrupted. So on that happy note, we'll end.